Right. Hello, everyone. This week we'll be focusing on the Western Hemisphere. So, in comparison to other uh, portions of the world that we've been talking about so far, the Western Hemisphere is huge. It consists of Canada, the United States, Central America, South America, the Caribbean. So you're talking about a large landmass, lots of different people, very different cultures, large numbers of people. Right. This is a pretty diverse and very large portion of the world. So, while there's all these different countries, it's obviously impossible to discuss every one of them. So, this discussion is going to follow the book, and we're going to cover Canada, United States, Colombia, and Peru. All right. So, first, Canada. Um, when you talk about border security in the United States, everybody always wants to focus on the U.S. border with Mexico, especially when you talk about smuggling, human trafficking, etc. But if you think about Canada, Canada's got a very large border with the United States, and comparatively, it's very sparsely guarded, mostly because large portions of it are really quite rugged and not easily traversed. But it doesn't mean that smugglers don't use it. If there's a will, there's a way. Additionally, the Great Lakes have quite a long history of smuggling, um, especially like back during Prohibition and stuff like. There's been a lot of stuff going on in the Great Lakes as well. But anyway, obviously the topic is terrorism, so let's focus on that. So Canada is known for being diverse, immigrant-friendly, very tolerant. But according to the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, um, they actually have the most terrorist groups within their borders, second only to the United States. But in spite of this, they really don't have much of a terrorism history. So, kind of the main terror attack, in Canadian history occurred in 1984 when the Air India Flight 192 was bombed. Excuse me. And this was really kind of a stunning failure on the part of Canadian authorities. And then, after 9/11, not sorry, after 9/11, after this attack, they instituted some reform, but it wasn't until 9/11 that Canada really began to take terrorism more seriously. They created this system of information sharing and a network of agencies that are all connected. Um, they've also adopted somewhat tighter immigration standards and have done some other things in reaction to some threats, such as like they closed the Iranian embassy. Um, but in spite of these tightening standards and this creation of the Public Security and Emergency Preparedness Canada Department, Canada largely remains pretty reactive to terrorism. Now, the United States is a different story. The United States obviously has a much longer history with terrorism than our neighbor to the north. The KKK was founded in 1865 after the Civil War ended. Was led by Nathan Bedford Forrest. This KKK terrorized the newly freed slaves. They were formed in Pulaski County. Um, and then other groups started kind of forming too, but they really weren't organized in any kind of meaningful way until about 1867 when Forrest was elected Grand Wizard. By 1869, several thousand people had been killed. And then the Klan disbanded due to federal government beginning to address the violence through passage of the Federal Force Act. However, the Klan wasn't done. The Klan would rise again, and there have been several eras of the Klan throughout time since 1867. At times the Klan was very powerful, such as in the 1920s. We see these pictures where you have thousands of Klansmen marching in the streets of Washington. You had many powerful politicians that were associated with the Klan um, because of the political clout that they had and their ability to help get people elected. And then in the 30s, the Klan kind of died out again. Then during the 50s and 60s, the Klan was, pretty active again, in response to the civil rights movement. Died out again, and then reemerged in the 80s. So the Klan is still around. but much less powerful than it once was. And there's really not any longer any of this kind of national clan organization. It's much more decentralized with smaller, more pretty independent groups. Also during the 80s, there was this rise in left-wing. I'm sorry, not the 80s. In the 1960s, there was a rise in left-wing terrorism. Several different groups operating at the time, but two of the main ones were the Weather Underground and the Black Panthers. The Weather Underground was this anti-government group that participated in a string of bombings of government facilities, including police stations. Some of the members were convicted, spent some time in prison. Some were killed when a bomb they were building exploded. Then you have others such as Bill Ayers and Bernadine Dorn, who became college professors. The Black Panthers were also active in the 60s. They participated in violence against police officers. They planned murders. They rioted. But by 1974, that iteration of the Black Panthers was largely inactive. Combination of arrests, infighting, drugs, all kind of led to their downfall. All right, so then kind of the next kind of groups that kind of come on the scene, start committing violence in America were more of these kind of special interest groups focused on the environment and animal rights. Kind of the two main groups were the Earth Liberation Front, known as ELF, and the Animal Liberation Front, known as ALF. These groups kind of began in Europe and then kind of expanded in the United States. Between 1976 and 2004, they were responsible for about 1,100 criminal acts and about $110 million in damages. These groups' ideology, they're claiming they're fighting for the environment, for animal rights. They were set up as small cells with generally kind of this leaderless resistance structure. They committed many acts of vandalism, arson, bombings. They focused on logging companies, car dealerships, animal research labs, ski resorts, new housing developments, restaurants, meatpacking companies, or kind of anything else that they deemed was somehow destroying the environment or attacking animals. They've been pursued by law enforcement and also been targeted by legislation. And while they're not completely gone, their prevalence of attacks is really decreased from what it was in the 90s and early 2000s. All right, another single issue group is the Sovereign Citizen Movement. They're generally characterized as a right-wing group. Don't necessarily have to be, but that's generally how they're characterized. This is known as a movement rather than a group because this is an ideology that really encompasses kind of different groups and loners who don't really adhere to any particular group. Sovereign citizens view themselves as sovereign to the United States and therefore are not beholden to any of its laws, including paying taxes, driver's licenses, car registration, any of that kind of stuff. They'll often participate in what's known as paper terrorism, where they file fraudulent liens against the government officials or other people they don't agree with. They also participate in other kinds of fraudulent schemes. Kind of the most notable terrorist act from the Sovereign Citizen Movement was the Oklahoma City bombing committed by Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols. McVeigh bombed the Murrah Federal Building in an attack that was very similar to one that was outlined in the book The Turner Diaries, which is a far-right book written by William Pierce, who was the founder of the National Alliance. McVeigh was arrested 90 minutes after the bombing for driving without a license plate. All right, so since 9/11, Islamic terrorism has been, the main focus of the United States. Prior to 9/11, the United States should have been alerted to the threat, because in 1993, jihadists bombed the World Trade Center, but the perpetrators were prosecuted, and everybody's kind of moved on. 2 embassies in Africa were bombed. The USS Cole was bombed in 2000. So there were all these things that were happening that should have been a warning to the United States, that there was this terrorism threat. And there were some efforts to improve airline security prior to 9/11, but lobbying groups from the airline industry got a lot of those efforts scuttled. And then the book really goes into great detail about the history of Islamic terrorism, and extremism, which could be an entire video, unto itself. Be sure to read all of that. Okay, there's way too much there for me to cover in this video. But really, the kind of main takeaway we want here is that there were many warnings over the years that the United States should have heeded and should have been more prepared for 9/11. And then since the time of the book, there's been the rise of ISIS and ISIS-inspired attacks, across the country and the world. And even though both are diminished, right now, Al Qaeda and ISIS and other inspired groups still function around the world and still do pose a threat to the United States. All right, Colombia. Colombia has a long history with terrorism and violence. All right, so there's three main groups that we're going to be talking about. And those of you that are familiar with Colombia know the history with the drug trade, drug trafficking, drug cartels. There's a long history of violence in Colombia. But there's been three main groups responsible for terrorism in Colombia. You have the left-wing groups, which are the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, or FARC, and the National Liberation Army, the ELN, and the right-wing group, United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia, the AUC. The AUC was formed to counter the FARC and the ELN and to protect landowners. Throughout the course of their activity, thousands of Colombians have been killed and millions were displaced due to the violence. And even before the founding of FARC and ELN, Colombia has a long history of violence. 40s and 50s, there was a civil war that pitted agrarian and landowning elites against exporters and merchants. And I estimate 200 to 300,000 people were killed, during that period of violence. And all that violence and unrest, led to the founding of these left-wing groups. Both of them wanted a communist nation, wanted land reform, distribution of wealth, and social justice. But they quickly turned to violence and began to finance their operations with drug exports and kidnappings. FARC was founded in 1965 and adopted a Soviet-style doctrine, strict military structure. By the 70s, it was a full-fledged criminal capitalist organization, which is interesting because they founded themselves as this Marxist group, right? By the 70s, they were a full-fledged capitalist organization. The U.S. in this initially supported the Colombian government, but then during the 90s, kind of pulled back a little bit and provided less help. So then the government was kind of on, Colombian government was kind of on its own. They ended up ceding a large portion of the country to the rebels, in an effort to try to negotiate and try to come to some kind of agreement. But by doing that, that move only emboldened the rebels, and they expanded to around 20,000 members and just increased, their involvement in the drug trade, kidnapping, and extortion. Okay, we drink a soda, right? So then the U.S. then formed a joint effort with Colombia called Plan Colombia, where the U.S. helped to upgrade, train, and equip the Colombian military to combat FARC, which has been carried out mainly by military contractors. When Uribe was elected president of Colombia, the government aggressively went after FARC and weakened them. And then in 2016, there was a peace agreement reached, and most of the rebels laid down their arms. But there's still some holdouts even today, especially because since the time of the peace deal, it's been marked by reprisals against former group members, by vigilante groups, various other armed groups. You can't operate like that for all those years and not make some enemies. So there's still enemies out there. So this peace has been somewhat tenuous. All right, ELN. ELN was founded by university students, oil workers, and Catholic priests that followed this liberation theory, which is a mix of Catholic teachings and Marxist teachings. They were never as big as FARC. At first, they didn't participate in the drug trade, but focused on extortion, protection, and racketeering. But soon they got involved in drug trade like everybody else in Colombia because of the large amounts of money you can make, and pretty much became a criminal organization. At one point, they were down to around 100 members, But then new oil fields and pipelines in part of the area that it controls, led to this resurgence. About 5,000 people by 1998. They negotiated a truce with FARC in 2009, and then tried to join the peace discussions, the government had with FARC, but the government rebuffed them. So ELN returned to violence then. So as FARC was disbanding, the ELN took over much of their drug operations in the territory that they abandoned. They signed a peace agreement in 2017, extended it into 2018, but after that it wasn't renewed and the violence started again. And as of 2020, the government was still engaged in operations against ELN. All right, last group for Colombia. The AUC was formed by Carlos Castano, whose father was killed by FARC. He and his three brothers originally tried to work with the Colombian military, but soon left that. So they ended up getting involved with Pablo Escobar's drug cartel. So they gained some military training there from an Israeli mercenary that also worked for the drug cartel. They provided protection from FARC and the ELN and had quite a bit of support from business owners, landowners, and also the government. They also, they soon moved into the drug trade, got involved in oil pipelines, gambling, construction, and it was estimated about 70% of their income came from cocaine. They killed supporters of FARC and ELN. Then in 2003, they entered negotiations with the government, agreed to demobilize by 2005. They finished demobilizing by 2006 and turned in their weapons. But like everybody, like all these other groups, like not everybody did that. Okay, most people did it, but not everybody did. So the ones that didn't kind of formed their own crime groups, involved still in the drug trade. So if you want to kind of nutshell this whole discussion of Colombia, Colombia is in better shape than it has been in the past, but they still suffer from violence, from corruption. There's still a lot of problems in Colombia. All right, final country is Peru. Peru also has a long history of violence. They suffered violence and atrocities for many years under military dictatorships. And while we could focus on that stuff kind of as examples of state terrorism, we're going to, again, just look at the groups that were operating in Peru. Shining Path and the Tupac Amaru Revolutionary Movement, or MRTA. Shining Path was formed in the 60s and adopted a Marxist ideology that vowed to destroy the Peruvian state and then formed this utopian Marxist state run by the peasants. It adopted a traditional guerrilla warfare model and recruited college students and peasants. They trained and recruited members, but didn't engage in any violence until about 1980. They helped local farmers process and traffic their cocoa products. Interestingly, something different that they did from a lot of other groups was they recruited a lot of females, specifically teachers, to help them spread their ideology. And then a lot of these teachers that were recruited into the organization became leaders, and at times comprised about 40% of the membership, which is somewhat rare for a terrorist organization that are generally male-dominated. They never numbered more than about 10,000 members, but at one time they controlled about a third of the country. They were responsible for about 37,000 deaths, committed about 4,000 attacks, bombed schools, shopping malls, conducted ambushes, assassinations, kind of a wide variety of stuff. In 1992, the leader was arrested along with his computer that contained membership numbers, information on weapons caches, and a lot of other important information. Shining Path still exists, but seems to be much more of a criminal enterprise. It's engaged in drug trafficking. The final group we're going to talk about is the MRTA, which was founded in the 1980s. It was always much smaller than the Shining Path, but they also wanted a Marxist society. They tried to avoid violence, but would attack, kind of these wealthy elites and these wealthy holdings, but rarely would they engage the military. In the 90s, leaders started to be arrested. And then, kind of as a way to strike back, the MRTA took over a party of ambassadors, or a party for ambassadors and diplomats, and took a bunch of hostages. They occupied, the residence where the party was taking place for 126 days. And then in 1997, government troops stormed the residence using tunnels that they had dug underneath, killed all the terrorists, and the organization never recovered after that event. All right. Well, I know this was a lot. And there's other additional articles on Blackboard to read for this week. Be sure to read all the materials and complete your assignment for this week. As always, please let me know if there are questions. I'll see you next week.